To discuss the security situation in Kenya, we are joined by Andrews Atta-Asamoah from the Institute for Security Studies in Africa. Andrews, good morning to you and welcome to AM News.
Good morning.
Andrews, what is your take on the Kenyan government's handling of the militant attacks on citizens? Is the state doing enough to protect its citizens?
Well, the state has done some good things. If you look at it from 2011 up to now, you see an increased visibility of the security forces on the streets and particularly in vulnerable areas. You also see some attempts to try and bring the communities on board. There's an operation called Nyumba Kumi, which is to try and encourage citizens to know at least 10 of your neighbors in order, to try and be your neighbors, watch the back of your neighbor. There's also been some attempts to increase intelligence collection and also to screen particularly refugees in areas that are suspected to be harboring some of these terrorist groups. But if you put that on one side, then the government has made some really visible moves. But on the other hand, you find that many of the attempts by the government has sometimes had political undertones, has sometimes you see delayed response in areas where attacks happen, and several other lapses here and there. So there's also a general militarization of the government's response in the way they are dealing with the threats of radicalization in the country. So on a balance, you find a government that is quite desperate for options to address a security challenge, but one that is grappling with the fast and very amorphous nature of the threat they are dealing with. But some efforts have been made by the government.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're talking about those security threats. It seems that the country, though, is failing to secure its borders adequately, as it has suffered a series of attacks by al-Shabaab militants, which is coming from the neighboring lawless Somalia, in alleged reprisals for Kenyan troop deployment in that country. Do you think, though, perhaps that tightening border controls can help repel some of these attacks?
Yes, you're right. Tightening border controls will help repel most of the attacks. But the question is, to what extent can you effectively police, the land borders, which is more than 3,000 kilometers, long? You have huge trouble dealing with that. And so the inflow of arms from across the border from Somalia into Kenya is huge. Kenya shares more than 600 kilometers of border with Somalia. And that is, a huge task if you want to effectively police it. But one thing that the government has done is that for known routes, they've upped the policing of those entry points. Particularly if you are flying from Mogadishu, for instance, to Nairobi, you go through series and series of checks. But the question is, how many of these attackers will come through those approved routes? And that is what makes it very difficult. But you are right, upping policing of borders to be a huge addition to what the government needs to do to address the threats.
Andrews, has the country learned, though, any lessons from the previous attack, like the Westgate shopping mall attack last year? And are those lessons implemented to try and improve the security situation in the country?
Well, some lessons have been learned. If you look at after Westgate, for instance, the government has tried and bring on board citizens. And as I indicated earlier, there's an operation called Nyumba Kumi, which is basically to try and know, 10 of your neighbors for what it implies. But on one side, a lot of that, there's still been lapses. For instance, the current attack that we are seeing in the last couple of days, there's been some politicization of even the government's communication about it. And so sometimes, as much as one wishes that you have a united country addressing the threat to the stability of the country, you don't get all of these coming through as one wishes. And that becomes a vulnerability on itself. So some lessons have been learned, but really not all have been plowed into the response as yet.
Now, hardline militancy, as we note, is a global problem. For instance, even in Nigeria. Is Kenya cooperating with other countries in Africa and even in the US and UK to try and secure itself?
Yes, particularly with Western partners. Many of them, particularly UK and the US, collaborate with Kenya, particularly in terms of capacity building, equipping the Kenyan security forces, particularly in the area of counterterrorism. So that is largely positive. Also, there's some level of intelligence sharing, even though sometimes there are questions that are unanswered, because there's been certain times that Western embassies, issue travel advisories only for the government to play it down. And then at the end of the day, you find the threat materializing. So it raises questions about the extent of information sharing among the intelligence community. But broadly, they collaborate on several fronts in dealing with the threat in regards to Kenya.
Now, Andrews, just lastly, how much is this raging war in Somalia compromising the security in the whole of East Africa?
I think one thing that is evident is that gradually the al-Shabaab insurgents have been able to regionalize themselves in terms of having physical representation on the ground, but also in terms of broadening those who are sympathetic to what they stand for. And so sometimes it's easy for them to hate at Kenya because they have other groups along the coast who share and even recruit for them. And that makes it very quite dangerous. We've seen that they've hit places like Djibouti, they've also hit Uganda, and they've threatened to hit other places. So the regionalization of the al-Shabaab threat has practically also regionalized the Somali conflict to some extent and made it a region-wide threat rather than a Somali crisis, as we've always spoken about it.
Andrews, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
That was Andrews Atta-Asamoah from the Institute for Security Studies in Africa talking to us about the attack that happened in Kenya.